Democracy Nerd. I am Jefferson Smith. We tried not merely to avoid discussing sometimes uncomfortable topics. We went back and talked about the cynical use of critical race theory as a political boogie person to win elections, or using race to both disenfranchise and alienate voters. We also want to dig into issues regarding economic inequality and how major wealth disparities threaten democracy. Not only that they have issues themselves about how it feels to live in the world, but actually how, if all we do is nerd out about democracy, how does inequality impact democracy? How does wealth inequality impact democracy? As Robert Lieberman, who was a co-author of Four Threats, explained on a previous episode, increased racism and economic inequality have continually been two of the repeated threats, two of the sort of preconditions of the rise of fascism and threats to democracy throughout American history, as well as looking at global analogs. And so it's important to talk about this stuff. And it's also important to admit our own lack of expertise. I'm not a trained economist. I enjoy talking to people smarter than I am on any number of topics. I'm not a scholar in race studies. Again, I want to look to other folks for expertise on those subjects. Today, we're joined by a guest who straddles both topics, bridging the Venn diagram of issues relating to racial and economic justice in the United States. Francisco Perez, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Utah, former Director of the Center for Popular Economics. He joins us to talk about an essay he wrote, How Do We Build Back Black Wealth? Understanding the Limits of Black Capitalism. Professor Perez, thanks for putting up with that introduction, and thank you for being and joining us to discuss topics on Democracy Nerd.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
Before we get into your writing, your essay, let's hear a little more about your background. Talk to us about the Center for, or I guess is it Center for or Center of Popular Economics?
So the Center for Popular Economics is a collective of political economists based out of the University of Massachusetts and Amherst. So we're students, faculty, and alumni associated with the University of Massachusetts Economics Department. And we've been around since about 1979. And the goal originally was to get these economic ideas out of the ivory tower and into the hands of regular people where they can use them. So the University of Massachusetts at Amherst has a longstanding reputation as one of a handful of progressive economics departments in the country and sadly in the world. So as part of that tradition, there was a commitment to really working with originally labor unions and sort of rank and file labor union members. And then obviously, sadly with the decline of the labor movement, have been working more and more with social and economic justice organizers, right? So we've been developing materials, workshops, different materials to help people understand what the economy is and how they could change it, right? So hopefully putting useful tools in the hands of folks fighting for justice.
You said one of the few economics departments that comes from a progressive perspective. I think you said, sadly. Let's dig into that a little more. Say more about that, both why, I have my own guesses, but yeah, how do you think about that?
So there's only about 4 or 5 universities in the US where you could speak about capitalism in any sort of critical fashion, right? The University of Massachusetts and Amherst is one of them. The University of Utah, where I'm speaking to you from, is another.
How come?
That is a great question. So my answer to this is economics is the language of power. It is the most powerful of the social sciences, right? I always joke with people, there is a council of economic advisors. There is no council, to the president of the United States. There is no council of sociological advisors or anthropological advisors or historical advisors, right? And therefore, what that means is the economics profession is much more heavily policed ideologically because there is a direct connection to policy and the policymaking apparatus. Again, because economics is the language of power. So they definitely do not want, they certainly don't want regular people participating, and they definitely do not want people with more critical views or with commitments to justice, equality, a broad vision of freedom to be part of these conversations, right? Which is why I do the work that I do, both my research and then also, popular education and outreach efforts like this one, is because, economics is a social science. We're studying human behavior. And anytime you're studying, anytime you have human beings studying other human beings, the question of values is simply impossible to sidestep, right? But that's, again, difficult to admit for many economists, especially given the connection to power, which they would rather not lose. So we, unlike in other social sciences, these more critical perspectives are much more effectively sidelined in economics.
So, for instance, if somebody outside the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, not to be confused with Amherst, the liberal arts college, somebody outside of University of Utah, somebody outside one of these very small number of economics departments were to come up and do something that really challenged sort of a Milton Friedman understanding, or even a Keynesian understanding of economics, there might be risks to funding. There might be risks to getting tenure if they started out early. There might be risks to getting published. You might not get invited, probably wouldn't get invited to serve on somebody's council of economic advisors. You wouldn't get invited to serve on either the big Fed or one of the more sort of localized Feds. You wouldn't get invited to play all the reindeer games.
Exactly. And it's even, academia, in general is quite elitist. Economics is even more so, right? So, all of the sort of, all the top publications, many of the top policy making positions, all of that goes to folks who went to one of, 5 or 6 schools, right? So if you are not in the club, if you didn't go to Harvard or MIT or Princeton or Stanford or Chicago or something like that, then, even if you're perfectly conventional, willing to say all the things that make people in power comfortable, it's highly unlikely that you're going to end up in a top academic or policymaking role, right? So, and that's, again, even worse, even greater concentration at the top than other social sciences.
So I thought a lot about, kind of from an activist perspective, from a pro-democracy perspective, what is lost by not having as many economists, as many people comfortable with math. I mean, I think a lot of the challenges people end up gravitating to political science majors do so in part because, they don't necessarily want to do a bunch of, econometric models, right? And that I know, I thought of it for a long time, that I think policy making, that I think advocacy loses by not having sufficient, or as much as we might have, kind of mathematical heft, right? I've thought of that. I haven't dwelled as much into what the scholarship loses by narrowing its focus, what the study of economics might be losing by not broadening access and having multiple approaches to solve problems. That might be too obvious a question, but let me ask, what do you think we lose by the fact that the game feels sort of locked?
I mean, I think we lose a lot. So one, this this is why I became an economist. Was I realized, there's a lot of different roles that need to be played on kind of team justice, and one of the most glaring things that was missing was more people with an economics background, with a quantitative background. So I kind of saw it as taking one for the team, right? Taking one for team justice. And I think what happens is, we don't have conversations like this, right? So I actually, my own research is on monetary policy in developing countries. I'm much more comfortable talking about interest rates and exchange rates and all of that stuff. But there are so few Black economists, so few economists of African descent that, we're having important discussions, during the 2020 uprisings following the murder of George Floyd, about what it would take to create racial equality in this country. And there are so few people with my skill set, or the skill set of an economist, that can contribute to this conversation. And that's often what we lose, right? Is you don't, in making the field exclusive, you end up with, the economics profession is disproportionately male, disproportionately white, disproportionately wealthy. A lot of economists have parents who are also college professors, right? So it's a very thin slice of life, and they tend to reflect the biases of those groups, right? So you're not going to hear, you simply don't have many economists that have experience of being working class, right? Of actually struggling to make ends meet. You don't have economists who face racial discrimination. You don't have, so the the questions that get asked in scholarly work and the question and how those questions are approached in policy work all reflect those biases, right? Who ends up in the field and then how that field is policed, right? So both of those push out more critical perspectives and I would argue the perspective of the majority, right? Most people are working class. Most people don't have a PhD. Most people are quite uncomfortable with numbers, right? So I feel like it all serves the objective of keeping the conversation among a very small group of people, right? So part of the work that the Center for Popular Economics does that I try to do is say, no, you have just as much right and just as much ability to participate in these debates, around policy, around political change as anyone else. You don't need a
Do you remember
PhD
when
to
it
understand.
was? Do you remember when it was? Do you remember the moment you said, you used the phrase, I want to take one for the team? Do you remember when you decided to take the path?
Yeah, so I had thought about it in college. I sort of knew that I was interested in economic issues. Took a few economics classes, was like, this is definitely not what I want to learn. This is not at all what I want to do. I was sitting in a class taught by a conservative professor, former Reagan administration official, and he told me things like, minimum wages are bad for low wage workers, right? Even though I knew that my dad's union job was the only thing keeping my family out of poverty. They told us that young people, don't need health care because, we're healthy and we're paying in for someone else and it's sort of exploiting us. And, I knew what it was like to be a teenager without health care and the kind of strain that puts you under where, yes, you're healthy, but if anything happens, if you break a leg, if you, hurt your hand, that's going to be a very expensive medical bill. So I completely ran away from economics. I was like, I want nothing to do with this. And then did a master's in international development, worked abroad, was working in West Africa during the Ebola crisis on development projects, and realized if you don't have the macroeconomic picture right, then these smaller interventions are basically irrelevant, right? So you have to really understand the big economic picture, the macroeconomic picture. So at that point, this is sort of 2013, 14, about 10 years ago, I realized, let me just bite the bullet and do it. Someone needs to understand these tools and participate in these conversations and hopefully translate for everyone else.
Oh, even with my more cursory study of economics, with my consistent interest since then, or at least if not consistent, frequent, the study of economics is based on assumptions. Many of those assumptions offer absurdities on their face. Even the basic idea that humans are rational utility maximizers that are essentially fixed points rather than impacted by mirror neurons and the ability to market and persuade, so that in fact the definition of utility is not a fixed point, but is highly dynamic. Even that basic idea, right, is only illustrates the importance and challenges that assumptions pose to the field. And it just occurs to me that if it is too monochromatic, too monotheistic, if the study group that is analyzing those questions comes from too much of the same background, that you might not cross-examine many of the assumptions in the same way. By you, I mean them.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples. So I teach development economics, and part of what we have to teach in the class is the debate over foreign aid, which famously took place several years ago. But the two leading participants were Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly, both of them, great scholars, but older white men based in Manhattan, right? So I'm like, you're having a conversation about the billions of people in the global South struggling with, serious poverty, and the leading figures in that debate are two people who have, virtually no real world, firsthand experience of what it's like to live that kind of life, right? And I feel like, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure, I don't think that simply diversifying the folks at the top is enough, but I do think that you would want some different voices, and I think economics would certainly benefit from just a wider range of people going into the field. And I think to your point earlier, it would also, help people question some of these sillier assumptions.
So University of Utah, my grandfather taught there, my dad attended there. In fact, if you go to Kingsbury Hall, you can see a picture of my grandfather in the ante room. It's sort of a place that people gather before they go inside the theater. And I will say, when I think of cities of diversity, different maybe now than 15 years ago, right? When I think of cities of diversity, Salt Lake isn't first on my list, right? No knock, right? But how long ago did you start there? Was it just this year, or did you just become?
Yeah, this is my first year. I just started in August. I'm wrapping up the spring semester. We have a few weeks left. But what brings me to Utah is, this is a pluralist department. So it is one of the few places that is open to various approaches, not simply kind of neoclassical economics, which is, we think of as the mainstream, which is, everyone is a self-interested, rational individual agent maximizing their utility subject to various constraints. But, I have colleagues here who are post-Keynesians, right, who have who built on Keynes's legacy. I have colleagues who are institutionalists. I have colleagues who are Marxists, who are feminists, and that is rare, right? Again, Utah is one of the very few places where that happens. So that's why I'm here, right? Salt Lake is a beautiful city. There's some gorgeous mountains. We're looking forward to getting out into the national parks this spring and summer. But the primary reason I'm here is because this is one of the very few places that has just a much more open-minded approach to economics.
Let's dig into the piece you wrote for the Nonprofit Quarterly last year. And the title, I think that I have it right, is "How Do We Build Back Black Wealth? Understanding the Limits of Capitalism." I am reminded of a talk. So I've helped book speakers and been involved with TEDx talks over the last while. One of and a good friend of mine who did one of those talks, who we were able to thankfully recruit to do one, named Rakaya Adams. And Rakaya Adams is an investor, previously a lawyer. I am still hoping she will be a candidate for something. But her talk was about Black wealth, and it was about and I'm going to misquote, or I'm going to mischaracterize her sort of basic stat. So you can fill in the stat that I screw up. But it was essentially that if you look at Black wealth from the Civil War to now, there's been very little to essentially no growth that you've seen. And then she had lots of examples, including, of course, home ownership and how redlining and inability to get loans, which was the ability to get loans was such a big wealth driver for middle-class white Americans in the post-World War II world, that was not offered in equal measure across the American experience. And she's not the only one, of course, to dig into this stuff. But I think there is a growing awareness over the last blank number of years, you tell me, about how not only the game has been rigged, but how that has impacted the mathematics, how that has changed the arithmetic of economic power in the country. Start by how banks responded to the 2020 Black Lives Matter anti-racism movement after the killings, as you mentioned, of George Floyd, not only George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and more, to be clear. And the nation's leading 1,000 corporations pledged to invest $200 billion in Black-owned businesses. Talk to us about that response and sort of how you were viewing it at the time, and maybe even how you view it now.
Yeah, great question. So, that's really what motivated me to write the article. Was, I was watching all the protests following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor unfold, and saw some really radical rhetoric about how America was fundamentally racist, institutional racism, structural racism. So very kind of radical sounding diagnosis. But then the prescription would be, well, buy Black, right? Sort of support your local Black business, which by all means, if you're going to buy a book, go to your locally owned Black bookshop. But I knew from having looked at some of the data on the racial wealth gap that the idea that simply supporting Black business is going to lead us to some kind of racial equality or racial parity just seemed far-fetched because, if you look at, and here I'm referencing a great paper by Elora Duranoncourt, Chi-Hyun Kim, Moritz Kun, and Moritz Schularik. In the nonprofit quarterly piece, I referenced an earlier version of this. But if you're interested, this is one of the few economics papers I would actually recommend that you read. And they were able to trace out the history of the racial, the kind of the black-white wealth gap since the end of the Civil War. And what you find is there was rapid progress in the kind of 50 or 60 years after the Civil War. And then things have been pretty much stagnant since about the 1950s, right? So think about everything that's happened, the entire civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, all the way to the March on Washington, all the way through the Black Power era. None of that has actually made the racial wealth gap budge, right? So, if we're really serious about fighting for racial equality, then what actually does make a difference, right? And, whatever we've been doing since the 1950s has not worked, right? So I feel like, I was frustrated by the conversation because people were offering solution, people where I felt like were correctly identifying the problem. America is, deeply fundamentally racist, but the solution was not going to work, right? And we know that because we've been trying very different versions of it for the last few decades, and it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference at all.
So where do we go with that? If the investment decisions and commitments offer suggestions that road to racial equality is paved by successful Black businesses, is that a flawed theory? Is it a new form of sort of acceptable reparations? Where does that leave us? If it's been Lucy and the Peanuts comic strip, pulling the football each time and not yet moving the needle on Black wealth disparities or the disparities between Black Americans, white Americans, how do we think about the big move to buy Black?
Well, I mean, that was the first point I wanted to make in the piece is, it seems like if, there's a racial wealth gap, if white Americans have more wealth than Black Americans, then the kind of natural response is, well, let's support Black wealth, right? Let's support Black businesses, let's support Black entrepreneurship. And the problem with that is, as you said, it's Lucy pulling the football, right? So we've been talking about some version of support Black business since at least the 1880s and 90s, right? So Booker T. Washington was singing this song in the 1880s. There's various Black political movements and figures over time. Marcus Garvey famously, and then all the way through to our present day, right? So Richard Nixon, in response to the last major set of Black uprisings in the U.S. and then in the 60s and 70s, responded with a program of Black capitalism, right? That was the explicit name of the policy, was how do we support Black capitalists, right? So I feel like this natural sounding solution is not new and it has not worked. So I want, the first thing I wanted to do was help people understand what you think is going to make a difference is not, right? We have to look at what other tools we have in the toolkit, because simply saying, well, let's promote Black wealth, people have been making that argument for about 140 years, and that's been a major plank of policy, a bipartisan policy, right, for both Republican and Democratic administrations at the federal level since the 1970s, right? So Nixon had Black capitalism, but there's been empowerment zones and enterprise zones and all kinds of ways that the government has devised to subsidize Black businesses or businesses in Black areas.
And maybe this jumps ahead too much, but for the critic of reparations, for the person and let's say, if we can use the phrase a thoughtful critic, as distinct from just, right, somebody on Fox News using it to sort of pro-white race bait, excuse me. They may say, well, okay, so if blank, blank, and blank hasn't worked, why do we think reparations would? What do we think? What are we getting wrong? And does it suggest that that direct investment is flawed, or is just ain't going to work, or does it suggest that it hasn't happened sufficiently at scale? What else does it teach us?
So, the paper I referenced earlier by Duran and Court and co-authors, I feel like does a good job of laying out the different options. So, they explain, so there's two big problems, right? The first is the initial gap, right? So we obviously know that in 1870, right, a few years after the Civil War ended, or I guess 1865, when the Civil War ends, white Americans have much more wealth than Black Americans, right? So there's that initial gap. And then, people make money, right? So what are the kind of, how fast are Black incomes and Black wealth growing relative to white wealth, right? And what they show in this paper is, using some simulations, is first of all, even if you go back to 1865 and say, okay, from now on, all Black people and all white people will have incomes growing at the same rate and wealth growing at the same rate. So even then, the initial wealth gap would persist, right? Because you would even if Black and white folks made, accumulated wealth at similar rates, that initial gap is still there. In reality, we know that white folks have higher rates of return, right? They make more money. So you're not looking at a world where that gap is going to get smaller on its own, right? So you need some combination of wealth transfers, right? Some way of saying, okay, let's address the gap as it exists. And then also you need to change how Black and white wealth accumulate, right? Because, this is in response to some of the proposals for reparations that would cut Black Americans a large check and would either completely or largely eliminate that initial wealth gap, which, I support. But my concern is if white Americans are still earning higher rates of return on their wealth than Black Americans, then that gap will simply reemerge and reestablish itself. Even if in the best case scenario, we were able to actually close that gap. So
keep on going. Give us.
I feel like what your skeptic doesn't understand is, one, that initial gap isn't just going to go away on its own. No. And then two, we're not simply dealing with the legacy effects of racism, right? Of just like, oh, let's undo what happened 150 or 200 years ago. There is ongoing discrimination now, right? So there are barriers that Black Americans and other people of color face to building wealth in the United States right now, right? We're not talking about what happened to their ancestors, 200 years ago. We're talking about people being denied loan applications, people being charged more for the similar services, higher interest rates, lower access to some investment opportunities, all of it, right? So you're assuming that, again, that initial gap will just go away on its own, and you're assuming that there is an ongoing discrimination, right? Both of which are going to, yeah.
I was just talking, I didn't mean to cut you off. Finish your sentence, please.
So both of those are going to create and enlarge this gap.
Yeah. So I was talking to a good friend of mine who's been financially successful. And he said, there are a couple things that I didn't think about. And he had previously been elected to local office and is now not involved directly in government. He said, and since then he's got a little richer and he's gotten meaningfully richer. And he said, a couple of things that dawned on me now that I think about now. And one of them was, I used to think, well, marginal taxation, my point will be the second one, but since I said he said two things, I might as well say both of them. So I used to think, well, if somebody's marginal tax rate goes up a little bit, if they have a whole lot of money, why do they care so much? And I said, oh, because you still think if somebody's going to tax you an extra $100,000, it still feels like $100,000, even though you have more, right? You still remember what $100,000 is. And you don't want them to take that extra $100,000, even though it's not going to meaningfully impact your life in a negative way. The second thing he said was, the other thing I didn't recognize was how many times I would be approached, how sort of easy it was to find ways to apply my money in ways that would make money, right? That people sort of come to you and give you investment opportunities that I didn't know existed before, right? And so whereas if you go to Costco and buy in bulk, right, the cost goes down. My life, if you come in with less wealth and you want to be a member of the community center, the price is cheaper, right? That because capital itself can be commoditized, because that itself has value, that the operators of capital want to attract more capital so they give a better deal to people with more of it. It's almost like the flip of Costco, or in fact, like Costco for money. Oh, you have bulk wealth. I'll give you a discount on how we interact so that you bring lots of it here. So what you're saying is what you're saying resonates. How do you think about then? How do we change how Black and white wealth accumulate? Maybe that's every single part of how we understand racial equality, right? But if you're keeping your economist hat on, what are some of the highlights?
Yeah, so great question. I mean, this I feel like is the $1,000,000 question. So first, you're absolutely right. One of the ironies, I teach money and banking, and I tell my students, rich people have access to better investment opportunities, right? In various different ways. So one, if you're wealthy, you can put up your own wealth as collateral, so you're able to borrow. So ironically, those who have the most money can borrow the most, right? Because it makes sense from the point of view of a lender, right? So if this person doesn't repay, what can you collect, right? Can you foreclose on their home? Can you, they have multiple homes, right? So you're more likely to lend to someone who has a great amount of wealth, because if they don't repay, you have a way to recoup your losses. Ironically, what it means is those who have access to money can borrow on better terms than those who need money the most, right? Think about what it takes to invest in a hedge fund, right? You need to be a qualified, accredited investor, right? That is opportunities legally only open to people with a certain amount of net worth, right? So, that points to some of the problem, which is, even if you assume no more ongoing discrimination, America's completely gotten rid of racial discrimination, is as long as white people have more money, and as long as wealth grows, faster at the top, that alone would perpetuate the racial wealth gap. So I feel like, when we're talking about wealth, you're really talking about ownership, right? You're talking about ownership of assets, right? So, income, most of us understand, you get money every year or every month or every week, right? You get your paycheck. That's a flow. Wealth is a stock, right? So it's accumulation of those income flows, right? You make money, you save it, you put it aside, maybe you buy a house, maybe you start a business, right? But it's that accumulation that builds wealth. So you have to really address that, right? Which is why, in the article I mentioned Thomas Piketty and his famous work on wealth inequality, which shows that the wealth of wealth grows faster than national income, right? So if that's the case, then wealth is going to concentrate and become, societies over time become more and more unequal. And what he has shown in his work, him and his co-authors, is the only times we see wealth inequality reduced is through political intervention, right? So some either major war that destroys people's wealth, or some kind of social democratic package of progressive taxation, higher unionization, right? So lifting the wages of those at the bottom, reducing the income and wealth growth of those at the top, right? So, that marginal tax rate, is a small difference from year to year, but part of what's clear in this paper on the long-term dynamics of the racial wealth gap is, a half a percentage point difference over a century makes a humongous difference, right? So these, could be seemingly small differences, but if you extrapolate them over a long enough period of time, over generations, they have big, big impacts, right? So the question is, how do we address who owns what? Right? The question of wealth transfers, and then how do we think about the returns to wealth, right, of various wealth holders, right? So the question of, can we envision a large transfer of wealth from white Americans to Black Americans, and can we envision a world where Black wealth grows as fast, if not faster, than white wealth, right? Which would require changing a whole lot of policies, right? That's not something that can be easily done or done overnight.
So something just occurred to me, and that could be dangerous either because it's occurred to everybody else already, or it could be dangerous because it misses something important. And it might be dangerous for other reasons because I haven't thought about it enough. But something just occurred to me, that when you were saying that these multiple initiatives over history have not sufficiently move the needle. And it does occur to me that if we take like the 1960s, right, and the sort of aftermath of that, sort of maybe the greatest, uh, more modern kind of period of coming to grips with the civil rights movement, right? That shortly thereafter, like there was basically a decade of the 70s, and then you had, starting in 1980, you had the beginnings of kind of trying to take down the welfare state, trying to take down the growing income disparities, lowering of marginal tax rates for wealthier Americans, that essentially saw the middle class was growing. And then as soon as the country said, oh yeah, you know what, let's relook at our mistakes with not only pre-Reconstruction, but after. And then right after that, so just at the time where there might have been kind of a more pro-civil rights response to our economy, at that very moment, there was a growing rise of right-wing economic power, or right-wing power within the economic structures, and a decline of the middle class overall. And the kind of hopefully mildly racism aware part of my brain recognized, oh yeah, maybe not a coincidence, right? That right after, more people were being more explicitly included in the understanding of what it is to be American, then the wealthy class said, okay, well, we're gonna hold on to ours more. But also maybe it also lends itself, maybe, that not all of those experiments were flawed. Well, of course, every experiment is flawed, but not fundamentally or fatally flawed, but rather that at one point they were facing a context that was a pre-civil rights context, and then shortly thereafter they were facing sort of Reaganomics context where it was hard for everybody. It was becoming harder for everybody to get to sort of catch up and enter the middle class if they weren't, or go beyond that if they weren't there already. All right, so that was inartfully said and incompletely considered, but it just occurred to me, so I offer it to you.
Yes, so that's a great question. One, I should say, we do cover this in our curriculum for the Center for Popular Economics, which all of you can access. It's on economicsforemancipation.net. So that's economics, 4 is in the number, foremancipation.net. And we have a whole module on sort of 20th century American economic history and the transformation from kind of a classical liberal period, liberal in the European sense, not in the like, I voted for Biden or Bernie sense, but like in the free market fundamentalist sense, that ends in the 1920s, when kind of with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, and in the US, this is exemplified by the New Deal, the formation of a rudimentary kind of welfare state, right? The Social Security Act, which provided social insurance for, which created old age pensions, created benefits for widows and people who are sick and disabled, right? So, the beginnings of sort of American social democracy. And then we talk about the transition from that kind of New Deal era, right? Where, even the Republicans were sort of New Deal Republicans, right? Think about someone like Eisenhower and how he would absolutely not fit in the Republican Party of today. Even, someone like Nixon could declare we're all Keynesians now in the 60s. And then you see the kind of, the neoliberal turn in the 70s and into the 80s with Reaganomics. And we argue that, it is not a coincidence that these changes happen shortly after the civil rights movement. In our telling of the story, through the kind of, golden age of American capitalism in the 1950s and 60s, really of global capitalism. These were the 30 glorious years in France. This was sort of the biggest boom period in most of Africa, Latin America, and Asia until that time, right? So this was, the economy was doing really well, relatively. And then we had all kinds of social movements, right? So you had the civil rights movement, you had Stonewall, you had women, you had the feminist movement, second wave feminism, all right around the same time. And you also have growing labor militancy, the strongest unions, until that point in the US. And you get stagflation, right? And we argue that that sort of combination of economic, political, social, and cultural factors is what led to this sort of Reagan counter-revolution, right? So they weren't simply responding to what the civil rights activists were doing, but it was this sort of general sense by elites in the US, in North America, and Western Europe that things were getting out of hand. The sort of lower orders were becoming uppity. Women were no longer staying in their place. Black people were no longer staying in their place. This is the era of decolonization. People in the global South aren't staying in their place. So, this I feel like not only was it an economic sort of movement to privatize, to deregulate, to restore free trade and free capital mobility, but it was also an attempt to politically roll back the gains made by all these various subaltern social groups, right? By people of color, queer folks, women, et cetera, right? So, it was an attempt to it was a rollback on many fronts.
So, and going back a few, so thank you for that. That is helpful. And so so my question falls more in the category of a lot of people thought about this already than in the category of getting it way wrong, which I appreciate. I'd rather that, particularly in the subject matter, there's some comfort there. And going back a little bit, this sort of question is, okay, let's buy black. What I was reminded then, and maybe just because as I think of another friend of mine who was the sort of political director for Harry Belafonte some years ago. And Harry Belafonte had the kind of relatively well-publicized feud with Jay-Z, because Harry Belafonte criticized Jay-Z and Beyonce for not deploying more of their both social and economic capital to the fight for justice. And Jay-Z's comment was like, my presence is a charity, right? And Jay-Z later sort of said, I wish I hadn't said that. But it still reminded me of this idea, okay, is blank number of black rich people enough, right? Or let's say enough. How big a part of a move for justice is that, right? Which is a little different than, or maybe it's the flip side of buying black, and how much needs to be done structurally. And I understand that that's kind of the question to which we're talking about overall, but I'm reminded of that. Going back to that question, when you think of the limits to Black capitalism, what are the highlights? What are the takeaways for either as teasers for people to dig into your essay, or as takeaways if what they get is this conversation?
So the three biggest things, so there's three reasons I'm skeptical of Black capitalism, which is what I would want people to take from this conversation. So the first two are, is it even a viable solution, right? So what an empirical analysis shows us, right, looking at the data, is at the rate we're going, the racial wealth gap will never close. Or if you want to use a few more optimistic assumptions, we're talking about 150, 200, 250 years, right? At which point you're in justice delayed is justice denied territory, right? So
and artificial intelligence will be in charge then anyway, and right. Elon Musk will be trying to go to Mars. It's a whole different world.
Right. I mean, yeah, we may not.
By the way, Mars is for quitters. Mars is for quitters.
So the first is, on a purely practical level, if the solution to the racial wealth gap is Black capitalism, then it may not be a viable, realistic solution, right? We're talking never or forever in terms of closing the racial wealth gap. The other objection is, okay, let's assume that we can figure out a way to close the racial wealth gap in, a reasonable period of time, say a generation or two, and we will live in a world where, the top 1% of American wealth holders have, reflect the broader population, are 14% Black, 17% Latino, 1.5% Native American, 4 or 5% Asian American. And, to me, the question is that a world we want to live in, right? Is that the end goal? Is the end goal simply an elite as diverse as the mass of people they exploit? And I would argue it's not, right? It's not desirable, right? I don't think we're going to kind of, have enough Jay-Z's to make a difference to close that racial wealth gap. And then even if we did, right? Even if, the Davos set, people who meet at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland every year, even if those folks did look like the rest of us, is that victory? Or is it victory for whom in that case, right? Because I feel like, what, I would simply want to live in a world that is more just and equal and fair for everyone, right? I would not accept, I don't think we should accept large differences of wealth among white Americans either. Right?
A racially diverse oligarchy isn't everybody's sort of first choice, right? Like
No.
a plutocracy that is not a plutocracy merely of race is also not that great. But and it even goes further. And then you said three, and so far either I missed one or you said two. So I still want to keep at it. But I think about here's another embarrassing thing for me to say. When I was a kid, I remember I was playing catch with my pop, and he and I forget even how it came up, but what became clear was, I mean, I said that I thought that there were more rich Black people than white people, because there were more, because Michael Jackson was Black, because a lot of the most famous athletes, like a lot of the people that I followed, right, were Black, and I didn't, we weren't a member of a country club, so I didn't know quiet rich people. Who were like, which are most rich people, all right? I knew like famous ones. So I thought, oh, well, it's got to be that average income among Black people has got to be really high, right? Because so many of the people that that I'm aware of, and my dad communicated to me that my thinking was absurd. It also makes me reckon that not only is it, there, as I hear you saying, not enough Jay-Z's, I have to imagine when you're campaigning in Appalachia, that there is sort of insufficient, that Jay-Z's very presence, while in his view as charity, is also might suggest to dummies like me that we've gone a long way and gone further than we have in terms of economic equality. I hope I said that not too inartfully. I hope it makes some damn sense.
Yeah. So, part of the problem here is people, so there's all kinds of surveys done of Americans, and Americans underestimate the amount of inequality in our society, period.
Yeah.
They assume the rich are less rich than they are, and that average Americans are wealthier than they are. They underestimate the racial wealth gap. There are some surveys where, large numbers of white Americans don't even think that racism is still real, right? So, people have a very warped view of what is happening. I do think, there is in the society, I think about the election of Obama, for example, and how big a symbolic weight that had. People, again, one Black president after 40 something white ones, at that point, like I think 2 or 3 Black senators, a decent number of Black congressmen. That doesn't mean that Black people are suddenly in control, right? But I think, these appeals to representation do matter in a society where, people do not see many examples of famous or wealthy Black people. A lot of my skepticism comes from having lived in West Africa and seeing that, much of the anti-colonial movements were often about like, well, if we had African leadership, then Senegal or Sierra Leone or Ghana would be in a much better place. And, 40, 50, 60 years after independence, you realize that's not the case, right? Simply having Black people run the show isn't going to completely transform things. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. There's the role of foreign capital, and many people would argue that the economy is still controlled by folks from outside of these countries, and there aren't really Black people in power. But at least politically, right? You look at who's the prime minister, who's the president, who's technically in charge, and it is other Africans, right? And I feel like that, while that's better than the colonial situation, is not what it did not meet people's hopes from the immediate post-independence period. And I feel like in many ways, the discussion here in the US is still kind of stuck in that, what the equivalent of, for Africa would be the 1950s and 60s of saying, well, if we just had a few more Jay-Z's or a few more Obamas or a few more Kamala Harris's, then things would get really better. And by all means, yes, we need more. But simply having more kind of Black faces in high places is not going to close the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, so I heard you say two things. I heard you say, given the rate of change, both the kind of present realities and the rate of change, there won't be a good catch up. Second, that a racially diverse plutocracy oligarchy ain't all that great either. And you said there were three big points, and I caught those two. What I missed?
So, I
What's
mean,
the third
really,
one?
I should say too, because the first is really, some people say the gap will never close, or the gap will take forever to close, right?
Got
So
it.
you can either treat those as two separate arguments,
Understood.
never or forever, or you can say they both, both of these indicate it's going to take a long time, if ever, right? So I try to separate them because there are people who would argue it's just never going to happen, right? And then there's other folks who say, okay, well, let's just be really, really, really patient. And eventually, in what is it, 22, 23, then, maybe our great grandkids will be in a very different world, if not an entirely different world like Mars.
Yeah, the arc of the moral universe is long, but we'd like it to be not quite that long. Nice if it weren't quite that long a time. Okay, here's another dumb question. What if you were going to try to answer the question, how much? And we're going to say how much of the racial wealth gap is based on sort of starting points, and how much is based on well, Jim Crow just messed so many things up, or there wasn't any wealth to begin with, there was that they were not allowed to own it, right? The Black Americans were not, that those of us who were Black were not allowed to own it. So the starting point sucks so bad that it's just too hard to catch up. And then how much of it would you say is structural, right? And both could be 100%, right? They don't have to be either. It doesn't have to be either or. But if we were going to say 50-50 or like 30-70, and recognizing that at some point, if you start with $1, that's way different than starting with $100,000, right? But also, if you're earning 2% on your dollar versus earning 8% on your larger amount, that also creates a big difference. As you think about on the mathematics side, and again, the reason I say it's a dumb question is it's pretty reductive. But if you tried to evaluate how much of this is a starting point and how much of this systemic challenge that persists on that kind of on the curvature approaching equality, talk more about that.
So, one, I'll start with, so I've been focusing on the racial wealth gap. This is an argument that comes out of the work of William Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton. They argue the racial wealth gap is the best measure of previous and ongoing racism, right? So, because there's lots of different ways to calculate, if you're interested in reparations, if you think that, this country owes a debt to its Black citizens, there's lots of ways to calculate that, right? Some people say, well, what would have it cost if we had paid every enslaved African a proper wage, right? Do you use the minimum wage at the time, if there was a legal minimum wage? Do you use an average wage or a living wage, right? So there's lots of choices you have to make about, how to measure this stuff. What interest rate do you put on that, right? Because you're assuming, okay, well, if someone was making, instead of being enslaved, was a free Black worker in 1850, and they were able to save, $1 or $2 a week, what would that $1 or $2 a week look like now, right? And then you have to decide, is that wealth going to grow at 2%, 3%, 4%? Do you use the rate of growth of national income? Do you use the rate of growth of Black wealth, of white wealth, of some average, right? So there's a lot of different numbers. And this is why, I go through this just to say, because people, will often see a final number and think that it's very authoritative. And, people do put a lot of work into this, but there are subjective choices you have to make in order to come up with a number, right? So, the first thing I'll say is the racial wealth gap is, I agree with Darity and Hamilton, it is the best measure, right? Of just sort of, this is what, accumulated racism has meant for Black Americans, at least if you were looking for a quantitative score, right? Obviously, you couldn't, put a number on the lives lost, the dreams deferred, the oppression of American racism and how that's shortened and cheapened people's lives. The second question is, so there are people, I don't have the number off the top of my head. There are people who have tried to decompose, how much of this is the legacy effect, right, of slavery, Jim Crow, and then how much of this is sort of present day discrimination. So I don't want to give the wrong number, but I can tell you that there are people who've tried, and afterward I can look it up and send it to you. if you're interested.
And even just with an order of magnitude, like, is it sort of a hard question, or is it pretty clearly one or the other?
It's
Is in
both.
the pole position?
From what I remember, it's sort of a 60-40, 70-30 split where the legacy effect matters, but there's still a strong component of ongoing discrimination, right? Where you can't simply say this is sort of racism, inert racism. So I'll try to get you a more precise figure, but from what I remember, it was in that
precision
range.
and precision itself might be a fool's errand. Like precision itself
Right.
would be a challenging thing to have confidence in. But even just, I would be interested in it in the general, if only because a number we might not believe the number, but it would give it, but we might believe it within, a couple of standard deviations. So, and you mentioned Derek Hamilton, and this where he gets to sort of this idea of the baby bonds, right? So this was the thing my brother was pitching me at, who argues the government should provide that trust fund for every child who doesn't have one upon birth, and that would impact starting points, and then I think also by having an investment mechanism, then it could also keep the catch up, as distinct from a check of whatever size that could get spent, right? And spent in a way that, I'm not going to morally police someone's spending, but it might not be something, it might not all be spent then in a way that impacted the wealth gap over time.
Yeah, so one of the proposals to address the racial wealth gap, and not only the racial wealth gap, because these baby bonds wouldn't only go to Black babies, but the idea is if you don't already have a trust fund, then the U.S. government should help you set one up, right? So I think the last proposal I saw was up to about $60,000 per person when they are born that they could access. Would be put so treasury bonds that would be put in basically a savings account until you turn 18. And then when you turn 18, you can either use that money to go to college or start a business. This is, again, there's two ways to, you'd have to figure out some combination of wealth transfers and then altering the rates of return to Black wealth in order to close the racial wealth gap. So this is clearly in that first bucket of, here's a wealth transfer, right? Here is money that was not in your account that is now in your account, right? This is not, again, explicitly racialized. So, working class white children and Asian and Latinx children would get this as well. So it would make a big dent in the racial wealth gap because it would, give people a large wealth transfer and theoretically would allow people to access, assets that have higher returns, right? So, you could start a business, you can maybe buy some, you can maybe invest that money, right, and put it in a place where it's earning more than it would, if you had just $500 in a savings account at your local bank. The problem, of course, is, this is not the racial wealth gap is bigger than about $60,000 per person, and you still have no kind of guarantee that Black wealth will outpace white wealth in the long run, right? So. But it is, it would be a big step in the right direction.
Anything I haven't asked? Anything that you think is those takeaways, those sort of 2 or 3 takeaways of your, so people understand the limits of Black capitalism? I want to amplify, just because you said what you hope would be the takeaways, that catching up either will happen never, or it'll happen in such a long time frame that it is small solace for anybody who is alive now, or whose children are alive now, or whose grandchildren are alive now. And then the third is this idea of, if the only thing we do is have a slightly less racist but still deeply unequal, or in some respects growing unequal society, that doesn't seem like a great true north either. You were about to jump in, so jump in with whatever you want, but I just want to make sure that we've covered the ground you want to make sure we cover.
Yeah, so, we've covered a lot. Thank you for today's conversation. Just to reiterate, I would, really love this quote from Mirza Baradaran in her New York Times op-ed that I quote in the Nonprofit Quarterly piece, which is, if the rollout of Black capitalism had demonstrated anything, it was that economic power cannot be achieved without government help, right? So, what I really want folks to leave with is simply leaving, the idea of Black capitalism that, if you just invest in Black businesses and support them, that this will close the racial wealth gap and lead us to racial equality and racial parity is really a mirage. It has been tried. It has not worked. Free markets left to their own devices will perpetuate, if not exacerbate, the racial wealth gap. And we know what creates racial equality because we know what creates economic equality overall, which is, we the people have to step in and regulate or alter markets in a way that actually allows, that actually compresses wage and income scales, right? So what has actually worked against the racial wealth gap? Progressive taxation, higher unions, right? A tight labor market, so both in the 1960s and now, right? So we've been seeing that the racial income gap narrowing, and it's because, for the first time in a long while, the labor market in the US was actually working for those at the bottom, right? So we have to figure out some way of compressing overall wealth and income inequality, which will also serve to compress racial wealth and income inequality. And markets alone, left to their own devices, will never do that.
It's hugely helpful. I do want to get into something else. I do want to get
Of
something
course.
else. So I just finished watching Chernobyl, which and the mini series that HBO put out, brilliantly done, and about the Chernobyl nuclear, I'll call it accident, tragedy, and it was a reminder. I probably intended to be, but it was a reminder of the limits of the Soviet system, which is not the only manifestation of a system other than the United States sort of system, to be very clear. And it reminds me of the limits of a potential it's a big government, which is different than saying, well, there ought to be progressive taxation, or there ought to be an estate tax, or there ought to be labor markets. That's different, right? Having a command and control economy is very different than one that's saying that there should be economic and sort of political mechanisms that boost equality, right? Those are two different things. But it gets me even perpetually interested in downscale equality movements, and I don't mean smaller and less important. I mean more localized. We did an interview with an economist who the big project in Europe where they tracked the local efforts to produce renewable energy
Mm-hmm.
savings, and solar energy, and realized that if you added them all up, all these little local efforts, it would be. I mean, it was the kind of thing Alexander Ocasio-Cortez would be all excited about, right? But it was done not with the signing of one law, but with lots and lots of local action, right? Where people might be skeptical about having a Politburo in charge of everything, but might have greater comfort with, even though big scale, and the New Deal was centralized, big decision-making, really important. And I still am interested in this idea of sort of small scale at scale, of like localized, but not only saving one fish, right? Lots of people saving lots of fish, so you save as many fish as you possibly can, which makes me think of something I think you have much greater expertise than I, which is the Black cooperative movement, that mutual aid efforts, including those of former slaves during Reconstruction, and wanted to ask if they're, in addition to sort of the greatest hits of economic equality you mentioned, or some of them, if they're cooperative ideas, different ways of organizing economic activity that are also worth highlighting, also worth giving people, some awareness of.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up. I, can't believe I was going to forget. First I'll say, the curriculum I mentioned earlier, economicsforemancipation.net. So we talk about, the transition from social democracy to neoliberalism to Reaganomics. We also have a whole module comparing different socialist systems, or things that have been called socialism. So, the Soviet Union, sort of social democracy in Europe, right? So kind of Nordic social democracy, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, socialism in Yugoslavia, which very few people have heard of, which was a more sort of cooperative-based, market-based approach. And, also looking at the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, that form of socialism as well. So if you want to learn more about all of that, we have some materials, and then we also have a whole module on theories of change, right? Because a lot of where, at least as I interpreted your question, is how exactly do we see ourselves getting from point A to point B, right?
Yeah.
And there are historically, there have been different approaches. There's people who will tell you, you have to smash the system. The only way this is going to work is if we take over Washington and remake the country. Other people say, there's ways we can reform things gradually. Let's take an evolutionary approach, right, where we, make small improvements as we go along. And then there's other people who say, well, we can build alternatives here and now in kind of the nooks and crannies of the system, which has the advantage of, here, there's the stuff we can do right now, right? We don't have to wait for anything else to happen. We don't have to take over Washington or any kind of state capital. We can do this stuff in the here and now. So cooperatives sort of fall into that approach of, all of the other solutions I've mentioned in the article and in this conversation so far require government action, right? Wealth transfers, tax policy, fiscal policy, credit, all of that. This is stuff that people could do on their own that still addresses the question of ownership, right? So the appeal of cooperatives, and they've had a long appeal within Black freedom movements, right? So I mentioned in the article, W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about co-ops in the 1800s. There's a whole long legacy emerging from the freedmen's, from organizing efforts among the formerly enslaved, among freed people, to create their own kind of co-ops and mutual aid organizations. So this is sort of the other side, so there's the long tradition of Black capitalism. There's also the long tradition of Black cooperativism. And, to me, obviously no strategy is foolproof. There's issues with pursuing a cooperative strategy, but the advantages are, one, it's collective action, right? Individual, if it isn't clear from my conversation, I don't think individual efforts are going to get us there, right? So individual Black people making more money is great for them. That is not progress towards racial equality, right? Because you're as an economist, you want to change the averages, right? You're looking at a big group of people, not just one or two individuals, So, and then, secondly, it addresses that question of ownership, right? This is going from a world from where Black people have very little wealth to building Black community wealth or Black collective wealth, right? So this is, people owning businesses collectively, right? Not just, one or two people making enough money, because you see that, and why does it make a difference? One or two successful business, Black business people can always just, literally sell out, right? So you think about something like Black Entertainment Television, BET, which was founded by Robert Johnson, by a Black entrepreneur. He then sold it to a major corporation, right? To Viacom, I think, right? So it's, which has shareholders all around the world, but are, probably mostly, white Americans.
Black radio across the country, after they deregulated radio ownership, Black radio stations, they're all of a sudden, were eking out a living, and but really important cultural elements of their towns and beyond. All of a sudden somebody offered them, 7 figures or better for their radio license, and that sounded pretty good. And you saw a significant decline of Black radio.
Oh yeah, so there's, to me, I'm like, imagine if these radio stations or if this TV station had been collectively owned, it would have been much less likely to pass out of Black hands, right? And that's, it's great for Robert Johnson and those folks who cashed out. They've improved their wealth, but if we're thinking about what has, what promises to build the kind of greatest wealth for the greatest number, then I think, a cooperative strategy makes more sense. And again, has attracted some of the leading lights in the Black freedom struggle, people from W.E.B. Du Bois. There was a famous conference in 1940, I think, where Martin Luther King's father attended, and a young Martin Luther King Jr., who was maybe 9 or 10 years old, was there, right? So these are ideas that have been part of the Black freedom struggle for a very, very long time. And I think, as we're thinking about what the limits of Black capitalism are, we should be thinking about what the promises of Black cooperativism are.
That seems like a great way to finish. Any closing word? What do you want to plug? What should people check out?
So once again, www.economicsforemancipation.net. We have a bunch of videos talking about racial capitalism, talking about policies for redistribution and representation, comparing different forms of socialism, talking about the changes in political economic systems in the US in the 20th century, and talking about different strategies for change. In addition to basics about what is an economy, how do we understand exploitation and inequality, and trying to understand fiscal and monetary policy, right? So there's a lot in there. So economicsforemancipation.net. Please check it out, and we'd love your feedback on how to improve any and all the materials.
Also put in the, I put it in the chat in this conversation, which means I should probably also put it in the, we should probably put it in the show notes. But the Mercy Corps Northwest program that is a cooperative, essentially cooperative ownership of commercial real estate, to open up real estate ownership to a new class investor starting at, just like $10 a month. Let people sign up and become a little co-owner of their neighborhood, of their place. And when you were talking about, sort of cooperative models, and that is not explicitly a Black-led, to be clear, operation. It is in a neighborhood of significant racial diversity and including large East Asian population, large Latino population, Latinx population, and a significant Black population in Southeast Portland.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear about that. I mentioned earlier I'm a senior economist at the Center for Economic Democracy, and one of their projects is the Boston Ujima Project, which does something quite similar, which is they vote, right? They actually get together. These are Black and Latinx communities in Boston, although primarily Black, get together and they decide where they want to invest their savings in their community. So it's, a way I try to explain it to people is, imagine if your community was the loan officer, right? When you went to apply for a loan at a bank, the person who was evaluating your loan, what's the rate of return, what interest rate should we charge? All of that, is your project viable? Isn't an employee for Wells Fargo or Bank of America? It's your neighbors, right? So this is a way of investing collectively, right? So as a group in our own communities. So I feel like that, if you're looking for an example of some of this stuff in action, I would check out the Boston Ujima Project. And then
Boston what project?
Ujima Project. So
Ujima. Thank you. Yeah. And the guy running the Mercy Corps Northwest, he's got him John Haynes. And if you were writing on this, I don't know if we want to keep this in the episode or not, but seriously, if you wanted to, if you or anybody else was writing on it, because I think this stuff could be the hope.
No, this is where I think, we're going with all of this. So I want to learn more about, because I've been trying to keep track of who are the folks who are doing similar things, of some kind of collective investment where, and there's different ways of doing this. Ujima does one person, one vote, right? So it doesn't matter if you put down $50 or 50,000, you just get one vote in the project. There's other places that say, okay, if you put in more money, you should get more votes up to a certain limit. Ujima, if you're not living in Boston, you can't vote. So like you and I could invest, we could throw money into their fund, but the loan officers are the community. So we if you don't live there, you don't get a chance to vote. You do get a rate of return. So it is, people are trying different things. Who knows if any of this stuff's going to work out. These are all
his stuff is having real traction. And what's been interesting to me is that is it sort of pro-social, kind of liberal Democrats in Portland and in Oregon have been kind of slow to pick it up. Not the people who it benefits, right? They've been able to get capital. It's having meaningful success. I've just been really surprised there hasn't been a mayor candidate for governor saying, hey, anything I can do, what can we do to, get that to 10X? Because it's so promising. But I think he's having real traction, and it sounds, and it really do. I think it really is worth reaching out to him, because writing this stuff, I will get in the scholarship.
Because, and I think part of it is, I also talk to a bunch of philanthropy people, and I always try to explain to them that, like, you should be thinking about what you do with your investments. It's not enough to be like, oh, we made this much money, how do we spend it? It's like, actually, the bigger impact is where and what I find is there's a big divide between the program officer, kind of the people who dole out the money, and the financial investment people who are actually, choosing the portfolio and managing it. And I feel like, that's, you see it there at a concrete kind of institutional level where it's like different offices, different departments of the same institution. But, I think you also see it in a larger symbolic sense where, again, people aren't thinking about, like, how do we change investment? They're thinking, okay, once the city has taxed X amount of dollars, then where do we spend it? And it's like, well, what about looking at what your economic development corporation does? What about, I talked to cities about public banking, like, where are you putting your dollars? Are they just in Bank of America, right? Are they just financing whatever Bank of America wants to finance? Or, how can you, recycle those dollars locally, right? So I feel like getting folks to think more about like, the actual revenue generating side, not simply what do you do with the money when you can spend it, but like how you earn it, which again ties into this conversation about racial wealth gap, which is how do you like, we have to look at how we're generating wealth.
Yeah.
Right. If you're not looking at that, then you're not thinking, strategically.
And how we think about it now is, all right, a bunch of us will vote and then we'll elect some members of Congress and we'll elect a president, and then they will select a head of the Fed if it's time to do that, because nobody, they don't want to interfere with the independent Fed and don't want to. And so, and then we'll maybe be able to pass something across Congress, which is really, really hard. Right. So maybe do that. Or maybe you build a system like you're talking about, the Boston and GMA project, where people get to have control of the money together a little more directly. Not quite as much money, right? Not even close to as much money, but it's closer and it's near, and it's not either or. But I think it's fast. I think it's important. And I also put in the chat Rukai Adams, who I mentioned before, who used to be the chief investment officer of Meyer Memorial Trust, who was hired with the very point you made, right? When the new executive director, no longer new, of that big pot of money, was analyzing their work. It's like, wait a minute, we're giving all these grants, but on the other hand, we're investing in all this stuff, some of which is contra to what our sort of philanthropic goals are. So I really appreciate that stuff. And I mostly just want to say, because I don't want to chew up your entire day, thank you so much for your work. And thank you so much for spending time with us.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. This was a great conversation. I learned a lot.
Francisco Perez, you can find out more. Google him. Give the website again you want people to check out, because there's really good resources there.
Yeah, so Economics for Emancipation, so 4 as in the number 4, .net.
He's at the University of Utah. Francisco, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for being a democracy nerd.
Thank you.